Gopi Jana Balaka Girivardhari Yashodanandana Braja Janarandana Yashodanandana Braja Janarandana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunjabi Hari Gopi Jana Balaka Girivardhari Yashodanandana Braja Janarandana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Radha Madhava Shri Radhe Radha Madhava Radha Madhava Shri Radhe Jaya Radha Giridhari Radha Giridhari Shri Radhe Radha Giridhari Radha Giridhari Shri Radhe Jaya Jagannath Jaya Jagannath Jaya Baladev Jaya Subhadra Jaya Jagannath Jaya Jagannath Jaya Baladev Jaya Subhadra Jaya Gauranitai 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 Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai 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 Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Giri Govardhan Giri Govardhan Giri Govardhan Jaya Giri Govardhan Giri Govardhan Giri Govardhan Giri Govardhan Jaya Giri Govardhan Jaya Prabhupada 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 Shila Prabhupada Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada Shila Prabhupada Jai Vishnupada Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Astatara Sata Shri Srila Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Jai Gaura Premanandi We'll start this morning with Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, reading from the chapter Stay High Forever. And we're hearing at the moment Srila Prabhupada chanting in the park. People have come along. So this is a quotation. Everything is happening because of me, thought 19-year-old Judy Koslovsky. Judy Koslovsky. Everything I see is my own creation, and I am the supreme. Everything is mine. End of quotation. As the thought of being God obsessed her, Judy forgot her father and everything else. She was confused. If I am God, why can't I control everything? Why am I so fearful on LSD? Judy was a student at the City College of New York, majoring in art and history. She was taking guitar lessons from the Reverend Gary Davis, the blues singer and Christian preacher, who was teaching her the art of sad soul music. Today, however, under the influence of LSD, she had the overwhelming impression that she was God. She had had a fight with her father, who seemed cold and distant to her and couldn't understand her, and she had left her parents' home in the Bronx and travelled downtown. She was going to visit a girlfriend, and Tompkins Square Park happened to be on the way. When she reached the park, the kirtan was going on, but she couldn't see much because of the crowd. She weaved her way in closer until she could see some men, one shaven-headed, several bearded, dancing with upraised hands. And in the centre, she saw the Swami sitting on the rug, playing his drum. Dan Clark was 25, thin, intense, horn-rimmed, bespectacled, an avant-garde filmmaker, and his first film was entitled Rebirth. He was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War. And was working at a home for children as alternative governmental service. He had been a member of the SDS and the War Resisters League. He had been arrested during a protest demonstration, and he had been suspended 1 week from his job for wearing a peace button and a black armband. He was into Buddhism, but he had lately been adding a little psychedelic seasoning. Everything is nothing and nothing is everything was his slogan, and he would go around chanting it like a mantra. But he was feeling that, at least psychologically, he needed a devotional tonic. His Buddhist meditation was getting stale. Dan had come to the park today looking for the Swami and the chanters he had read about in the East Village Other. He had seen the Swami before, one evening a few months back. He had been waiting for a bus across the street from the Swami's storefront. He was on the way to a rehearsal for a mixed media show, and his friend had gone into Sam's luncheonette for a moment, when he noticed that in the storefront an orange-robed Indian man with a shaved head was lecturing to a small group of young people. Dan is a quotation. When I saw him, I imagined myself walking across the street, going into the storefront, sitting down and renouncing all worldly connections. But I thought to myself, it's only my imagination. After all, I'm married and I'm on the way to rehearsal and I don't know anything about the Swami anyway. So my friend and I got on the bus. But Dan lived only a few blocks from the storefront, and now and then he would pass by. Once he had stood for several minutes on the sidewalk, looking at the cover of Srimad Bhagavatam taped onto the window. Then, another quotation. It showed an oval lotus with planets around it, and right then I was introduced to the idea of spiritual sensuality. And when I saw the painting of Lord Chaitanya and his associates in the window, that really threw me. I thought, yes, this is what I need, juice. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We're continuing the fourth canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 28. Paranjana becomes a woman in the next life. Text 9. Kaman abhilashan vino Yata yamanschakanyaya Vigatatma gati sneha Putran darang chalalayan Aman abilashandino Yata yamanschakanyaya Vigatatma gati sneha Putra darang chalalayan Aman abilashandino Yata yamanschakanyaya Vigatatma gati sneha Putra darang chalalayan Amanabila Sandino Yatayamam Shakanyaya Vigatatma Gatisneha Putradadam Shalalayan Amanabila Sandino Yatayamam Shakanyaya Vigatatma Gatisneha Putradadam Shalalayan Amanabila Sandino Yatayamam Shakanyaya Vigatatma Gatisneha Putradaram Shalalayan. Would you like that? No problem. Kaman, objects of enjoyment. Abhilashan, always lusting after. Dina, the poor man. Yatayamam, Dale. Cha, also. Anyaya, by the influence of Kalakanya. Vigata, loss. Atmagati, real purpose of life. Neha, attachment to. Putra, sons. Daran, wife. Ta, and. Lalayan, affectionately maintaining. Translation and purport by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation. The objects of enjoyment became stale by the influence of Kalakanya. Due to the continuance of his lusty desires, King Karanjana became very poor in everything. Thus he did not understand the aim of life. He was still very affectionate toward his wife and children, and he worried about maintaining them. Purport. This is exactly the position of present civilization. Everyone is engaged in maintaining the body, home, and family. Consequently, everyone becomes confused at the end of life, not knowing what spiritual life and the goal of human life are. In a civilization of sense gratification, there cannot be spiritual life because a person thinks only of this life. Although the next life is a fact, no information is given about it. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnanjana Shalakaya Chakshu Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guru Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. In this verse today, we're hearing one of the greatest tragedies that can happen. Yes? A person in old age, consumed by old age, disease, and facing death, is fearful, is attached, has no idea what the aim of life is, and has become Dina, the poor man. The poor man. So now we're at this point in this allegory that Narada Muni is relaying, where King Puranjana is overcome by death. He's at death's door. And so unfortunate, he's continuing his lusty desire. We may think that, oh, when I become old, we automatically become attached, or, you know, the desires in the body, desires in the mind, everything lessens because the strength in the body is less. Our senses have become much weaker. We can't see very well, we can't hear very well, we can't taste very well. We may not even be able to move very well. But where do the desires sit? In the heart. So these lusty desires for sense enjoyment, sit within the heart. And even when the body does not have the ability to fulfill those desires, the desires continue. And what does that lead to? Frustration, anger, just a poor man. We can really take this on today. When I was reading this verse, I just thought, oh, yes, the poor man. The poor living entity that becomes so enraptured and entangled in material nature that the aim of life is lost. The aim of life is unknown. And as Prabhupada says, there cannot be spiritual life in a civilization based on sense gratification because we're only considering here and now. What is going to give enjoyment to my senses right here, right now? That's what I will do. We're not taking into consideration actually my actions right now giving me my next life, my next birth. And how much do we consider that our situation now is also as a result of our previous birth? So all of those things, being able to have some spiritual knowledge and spiritual intelligence, does not come in an environment of sense gratification. It comes in an environment of spiritual realization. And that is the Vedic civilization. That we have a proper society where spiritual understanding, spiritual realization is the center of everything, at every phase of life. And there are particular phases in life that we're meant to go through, brahmacharya, grahastha, vanaprastha, and sannyas, that lead to real detachment and that lead us not only towards detachment from this life of sense gratification, but understanding of who we are and our relationship with Krishna. And then we don't have to come back again. We can attain to a different destination. But what we're hearing today, for Puranjana, he has not understood the aim of life. He's at death's door, and he's still worried about his family, how to maintain. He's still absorbed in his materialistic life. So in reading this, I was remembering another personality that we hear in the Bhagavatam who's in somewhat of a similar situation. And I thought we'd go through that this morning because it's very wonderful, the history of Ajamil and how he was also faced with this situation, absorption in sense gratification, faced with death, and yet how was he able to turn his life around? So In the beginning of the 6th canto, we're given this history of Ajamya. And it begins, the 6th canto begins with a very wonderful question by Parikshit Maharaj to Shukadev Goswami. And he asks Shukadev Goswami, how is it that one can avoid falling down into the hellish conditions of life? Because in the 5th canto we hear of all the hellish planets, and so Maharaj Parikshit, he begins with asking this question, how does one avoid this situation? And Shukadev Goswami at first, he begins to explain the process of atonement. And well, in order to be released from the reactions of sinful activities, then you must undergo the process of atonement. And he speaks like this for a short time. But Parikshit Maharaj, being a pure devotee and extremely intelligent, he says to Shukadev Goswami, no, I don't see this process of atonement as being very useful, because people may undergo atonement and then they turn around and act in exactly the same way. So let's say we perform a sinful activity. We go through a process of atonement to try to repent for that, make up for that action. But if that process of atonement does not uproot the desire for that activity, we're just going to go back and do it again. You know? Unless something is really happening in the heart that's uprooting those desires that are forcing the action, then just trying to change the action is very much just on the surface. It's not deep enough. It doesn't have a lasting effect. And Shukadev Goswami, he glorifies the king. You're right. And then he begins to explain the process of devotional service by recounting the history of Ajamil. And he said, he speaks to King Parikshit that this history of Ajamil contains within it very wonderful instructions for becoming free from the desire for sinful activities, for sinful life. So this is actually what we're after. And I was thinking actually it is so timely for us to really meditate on this, coming up to the appearance day of Lord Nrsimhadev. Because many of the prayers to Lord Nrsimhadev, even Prahlad Maharaj prays like this, you know, don't let me have any material desire. Please take away the material desires from my heart with your ferocious nails, rip them apart. Yeah? So it's a very nice meditation heading into this time. That how are we going to have those material desires and desires that we may be carrying for lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes. They need to be uprooted from the heart, taken out. So how did that happen for Ajamil? Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with the history of Ajamil. Very famous and for very good reason. Does anyone remember how old Ajamil was when we meet him in this history in the Bhagavatam? 88. 88 years old. Right? So just as we're hearing of Puranjana now, he's overcome by old age and invalidity. So Ajamil was an 88-year-old man. But I'm sure we remember whose name he was calling. His young son. So his young son is described as a toddler. He speaks in broken language. He's just starting walking. And those of us who are parents, we know this is a very attractive age. You know, the child first starts speaking and very sweet, you know, and they toddle around and they plop down and you pick them up. And it's very charming, actually. So Ajamil, an 88-year-old man, had a toddler son. So we can see even in like quite old age, he was very attached to sense gratification. And he was very affectionate towards his son. Very affectionate towards him. He would take care of him all day. Ajamil had 10 sons, but Narayan was his youngest. And as we hear through this history, of Ajamil. Ajamil, in his young life, in childhood, he was a Brahmana. He was born in a Brahmana family. He was a very pious Brahmana. He performed all the activities of a Brahmana. He was very pure-hearted. He was very clean. He was very submissive. He studied the Shastra, and he was, in all senses, a very uprighteous, pious Brahmana. Now, what happened to Ajamil? Why is it that he, as we know, he maintained a prostitute, had his family with her, and then he maintained his family by many illegal and unrighteous ways. So now in Kali Yuga, we would think this is quite normal. This history happened a long time ago. So Ajamil, one day when he was in his youth, he was out and he saw a man and woman embracing, a man and a prostitute embracing. And this was very shocking for him. And nowadays, we walk on the street, we see whatever, and in some ways we become a little bit desensitized to that. But in this previous years, long, long ago, this was unheard of. You can see that it was very shocking. So he got a big, he was quite startled by this, and he was attracted. So in the same way, we may find ourselves in situations where our senses become attracted in different ways. This is just one example. So Ajamil became attracted, and yet he tried to control himself. And it's described, he tried to control himself by thinking of the knowledge of the Shastra. He tried to control himself in whatever ways that he knew how. He was trying to control his senses. He succeeded in controlling his external senses, but it's described in the Bhagavatam he failed in controlling his mind. So he became attracted. And as we know from Bhagavad Gita, this is the first step, yes, in this whole fall down into the material world. We begin to contemplate the objects of the senses. Krishna talks about this in the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. That by contemplation of the objects of the senses, one develops attachment for them. From that attachment, we develop the desire to have it. Yes, we must have it. We develop lust. Lust comes. Then after lust comes anger. Anger comes because we become frustrated. We can't get it, or we get it and it doesn't fulfill us. Then after anger, we become bewildered. Why didn't it work? Why do I have these desires, and why is it when I try and fulfill them, it's not even satisfying, or I lost. We become bewildered, and then it's described we just fall down into this material whirlpool. So Ajamil, by failing to control his mind, he started making plans how he could have that woman. And he did. He brought her into his home as a maidservant. And after he brought her into his home, he rejected his wife, his young Brahmana wife. He rejected his wife, and he began having children with the prostitute and maintaining her. And that is how he lived the majority of his adult life, maintaining her by any way he could. He was not in a truthful means of work. So he committed many, many sinful activities. Many. And now he's an 88-year-old man. His little son's toddling around. He's taking care of his son. And yet, what is he faced with? Old age, death. Death is coming. So it's described one day, he is laying down and he sees, who does he see? He sees the Yamadutas. He sees them coming for him with their ropes and their chains. And he is fearful. just as we're hearing today, Puranjan at the end, now this personality of Puranjan, he's faced with old age. He's become so poor, he's Veena. He's so absorbed still in thought of maintaining his family and maintaining his children. And yet he's faced with, as we've heard, you know, the city of nine gates, his body is being attacked from all sides. So he's in this fearful situation, but a situation of deep attachment. So Ajamil is in this situation. He's being attacked. Death is right there. The body is under attack. He can see the Yamadutas have come for him. And in complete anxiety, is described, in complete anxiety, let me see if I can find the verse. He calls the name of his little son. He just calls for his son, Narayan. He's in complete anxiety. Okay. Okay, so this is the 30th verse of the first chapter of the 6th canto. My dear king, the order carriers of Vishnu, the Vishnu Dutas, immediately arrived when they heard the holy name of their master from the mouth of the dying Ajamil, who had certainly chanted without offense because he had chanted in complete anxiety. Complete anxiety. He hadn't called out for the Lord, he'd called out for his son, but because he had chanted the name of Narayan without offense. Now, it's described in this chapter that although Ajamil had performed so many sinful activities over the course of his adult life, he was chanting Narayan's name all the time because he's calling for his son. He never used that name. He was never considering, I've committed so many sinful activities, therefore I chant this name of Narayan to get rid of those sinful reactions. He wasn't thinking like that. Wasn't thinking about it at all. He only was calling for his son. So therefore he said that name with affection. He said that he was chanting the name Narayan without offense. Interesting, right? Even though he was sinful, he was not trying to use the name to counteract his sin, therefore it's considered offenseless. Even though he wasn't directly referring to the Supreme Lord, but because the name is so powerful, the Vishnu Dutas arrived. And then Ajamil was witness to this amazing conversation. So it's described that the Yamadutas were trying to snatch the soul out of the heart. They were actually right at that point of taking the soul out of the heart of the body of Ajamil. Then the Vishnu Dutas arrive and say, stop, you can't do this. And the Yamadutas and the Vishnu Dutas have this amazing conversation. So at this point where the Vishnu Dutas and Yamadutas are having this conversation, Ajamil is not dead. The soul has not left the body. That is described, Prabhupada describes in the purports that the body of Ajamil is in like an unconscious state, but he can still hear. So he hears this conversation, and what an amazing conversation. If you have time, have a look at the first chapter of the 6th canto. Because in this conversation, the Vishnu Dutas and the Yamadutas are very, very polite to each other. They don't usually see each other because they go after different people. So the Yamadutas, when they see the Vishnu Dutas, they very respectfully, they ask, well, who are you? You're very beautiful. Are you demigods? Where have you come from? And why are you trying to stop us in our service to Yamaraj? This is our service. We take sinful people to Yamaraj. And the Yamadutas describe all of the external circumstances of Ajamil's life. They explain, because the Vishnu Dutas ask, why do you think he is sinful? And then the Yamadutas explained, just as I mentioned before, his life, he committed so many sinful activities, even though he had started life as a pious Brahmana. And then, so they properly take everything into account, the Yamadutas, but they forgot, they weren't really aware of the very significant action that Ajamil had performed of chanting. So when the Vishnudutas start to speak, they explain this to the Yamadutas. And if you want to hear some really inspirational verses about chanting, there's in this chapter. It's about the potency of the holy name. So the Vishnudutas, they explain that the chanting of the name of Narayan alone has freed him from the reactions of all sinful life. So therefore, you servants of Yamaraj, you cannot take him. You can't take him. One who chants the holy name of the Lord is immediately freed from the reactions of unlimited sins, even if he chants indirectly, jokingly, for musical entertainment, or even neglectfully. This is accepted by all the learned scholars of the scripture. Let's read a couple. As a fire burns dry grass to ashes, so the holy name of the Lord, whether chanted knowingly or unknowingly, burns to ashes without fail all the reactions of one's sinful activity. When the Yamadutas and the Vishnudutas are having this conversation, the Yamadutas, they accept what the Vishnudutas have said and they leave. They go back to Yamaraj, and in the next chapters, they have the wonderful conversation with Yamaraj, who, as we know, Yamaraj is one of our Mahajans. He is an authority on devotional service. So when his servants go back to him, they ask, who are these people, they stopped us from taking this soul away. Can you explain this to us further? Have a wonderful conversation with Yamaraj. And the Vishnudutas, they are there after the Yamadutas have left. They are there with Ajamil, and Ajamil, although he was in this unconscious state, he starts coming back to consciousness, and he starts to try to speak and glorify the Vishnudutas because actually he has heard this most amazing conversation. Then the Vishnudutas, they see consciousness come back into the body, and they leave. Now, Ajamil, I think I'll finish that and then I'll go back. So Ajamil, after he comes back to consciousness, he can understand that what he's heard was the most enlightening discourse of his life. And he completely accepts it as true. And he begins to repent deeply within his heart, his sinful life. He then actually becomes detached. As his 88-year-old self, he becomes detached. He actually leaves home, leaves his family. He goes to Haridwar, and he performs devotional service there in full Krishna consciousness, fully meditating on the Lord. And after a certain amount of time there, performing devotional service, the Vishnudutas again come for him and take him back. So it's a very wonderful history. And we get, there's so many instructions in this chapter. One that I've marked. This is when the Yamadutas are speaking. Yes, okay. And one of the verses, this is the 52nd verse, when the Yamadutas are speaking, they say this: the foolish embodied living entity, inept at controlling his senses and mind, is forced to act according to the influence of the modes of material nature against his desire. He is like a silkworm that uses its own saliva to create a cocoon and then becomes trapped in it with no possibility of getting out. The living entity traps himself in a network of his own fruitive activity and then can find no way to release himself, thus he is always bewildered and repeatedly he dies. Heavy verse. But this is the situation of the living entity enraptured in the material energy, that we become trapped in a network of fruitive activities and material desires. Very hard to release ourselves. How was it that Ajamil was released from his simple life, from his simple desires? He heard, as he heard this conversation, he had, as described there, just from a moment's association with the Vishnu Buddha, he was able to change his life. Yes. So just as we have this fortune, we're able to hear. And actually, I wonder if I'd like to. There's a really wonderful verse at the end of this pastime. Yes, where Ajamil, where he's lamenting his situation after he's come back into his body, the Vishnu Buddhas have left, and he's regretting his sinful life. Ajamil says, I am such a simple person, but since I have now gotten this opportunity, I must completely control my mind, life, and senses, and always engage in devotional service, so that I may not fall again into the deep darkness, ignorance of material life. Prabhupada gives a very short purport here. Prabhupada says, every one of us should have this determination. We have been elevated to an exalted position by the mercy of Krishna and the spiritual master. And if we remember that this is a great opportunity and pray to Krishna that we will not fall again, our lives will be fixed. So we have gotten this opportunity by the grace of Krishna, by the grace of Guru. We have the opportunity to hear and to take those instructions into our heart. By hearing and engaging in devotional service, this is the uprooting of those desires that are so firmly fixed in the heart. That's what can uproot them. Prabhupada says we need this determination. Yes? We must completely control the mind, life, and senses and engage in devotional service. So this is the second point I wanted to bring out today, is about sense control. Now, when we first maybe think of sense control or hear sense control, it may come across like we just have to restrain ourselves. We have to control, we often see like that. You know, it's like a restraint. You can't do something. It has to be controlled. But in Christian consciousness, we have a very positive way to control our senses. We don't have to restrain the senses in their entirety. We need to engage the senses. We engage our senses in the service of Hrishikesh, in the service of the master of the senses. Then our senses become controlled. So it's not that we just need to restrain ourselves. I'm not allowed to do this, I'm not supposed to do that, I'm not supposed to do this. But what we're meant to do is engage our senses properly in Krishna's service. And we have so many instructions on how to do that. That should be very, very clear to every one of us. How do we engage our senses and mind in Krishna's service? So we engage, first of all, we engage our tongue. Yes? We engage our tongue in speaking of Krishna, chanting Hare Krishna, taking prasadam. So important. In the 3rd chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Prabhupada says in the purport there, but that simply by taking prasadam, one becomes immune from the effects of the material nature. Very important. We take prasadam, we chant Hare Krishna, we speak about Krishna. We control the tongue in that way. We can engage So it's not even really like controlling the tongue, it's engaging it properly. Yeah? So if we think not so much about control, but how to engage my senses so that naturally they don't want to go after lower things. We lose the taste for the lower things. So we can engage our sense of sight. We can see Krishna, we see the Dham, we see the devotees. We can really absorb our sense of sight. Yes, so many beautiful things to see in Krishna's service. Hearing, yes, always. Yeah, we can engage our sense of hearing. We can engage our sense of touch in the pastime with Maharaj Ambarish, when it speaks about how he engages all of his senses, yes? Engages his sense of touch in touching the bodies of the devotees. Of course, very respectfully, we can touch people's feet, close, we can embrace, we can engage our sense of touch in preparing things for Krishna. We're so fortunate we can engage our sense of touch in touching the body of the Supreme Lord. How fortunate is that? Proper engagement for the senses is what we're looking for. Proper engagement for the mind. So that then when we are faced with the pushings of the senses, which naturally they push, we have urges, that is very natural, we have a material body, it's full of material senses and they push sometimes. But when we experience those pushings, because of engagement in Krishna's service, because of practicing that engaging the mind in remembering Krishna, hearing about Krishna, doing services for Krishna, then when the senses do push, we have a very great chance of just engaging them differently. And not being in this situation of a Jamil, where he was externally able to control it for a very short time, but his mind chased after it, is what we have to watch. We can also become quite well practiced in controlling the external senses, but where's the mind going? So the mind needs to be in sync with our actions, otherwise we will not be able to maintain that. And just as a Jamil, he started making plans and then he got her into his house, So we have to make sure that the mind is not running away from us. So we do that just by proper engagement. Engage the mind. Thinking, how can we serve Krishna? Thinking in Krishna's pastimes, Krishna's name, Krishna's devotees, however we can. However our attraction to Krishna is, we can meditate on that and derive great strength from that. So, as Prabhupada says, we need determination. We have to be determined. We can't be too complacent that, oh yes, I'll always be fine. I'll never face any challenges. Because we will, but we need this determination, just like a Jamia. I have gotten this chance. I've gotten a chance. Now let me use that chance to the fullest. Let me take advantage of it. Always engage in devotional service so that I may not fall again into ignorance in material life. Probably all remember this one that Prabhupada said, the difference between myself and my disciples is that I'm always praying to Maya, don't let me fall down. Not praying to Maya, praying to Krishna to protect me from Maya, that I will not fall down. So this is the mood of a Vaishnava, which, as we're hearing in this pastime of Puranjana, is the opposite of what Puranjana is going through. Poor man, Dina, poor man. Now he is just consumed by old age and death, and yet he is fearful, he is attached, he has no idea what the aim of his life is. What a sad situation. What a poor man. And we don't want to be in that situation. I remember, I felt so terrible actually. My grandmother, she passed away quite some time ago, just after I had left Australia and come to New Zealand. And she had been in like an old people's home for quite some time, quite ill. And my mother rang me just maybe a couple of weeks before, maybe even a week before she left her body, and said that her mother had been talking to her, saying she was so scared to die. She was so afraid. I'm just so scared to die. I don't want to die. I'm so scared. Oh, it broke my heart, you know, that I wasn't able to be there for her. But I wrote to her. But still, yeah, it's so sad. This is such a sad situation. It's tragic that people end their lives in fear, not knowing that there's a next life, not knowing who they are, separate from the body. This is tragic. So Narada Muni, he has come to give knowledge to King Prachinabharata, to save him from that very situation that he's explaining. So this is what the Vaishnavas do, try to alleviate the suffering of the living entity by giving knowledge of the self, knowledge of Krishna. And then we have this opportunity, we have a chance to lead our life in a different way and get to the end of life and face death. Every one of us has to face it. How are we going to face it? Will we be fearful? Will we be afraid? I really meditate on that. I'm like, how am I going to face death? It's coming. And, you know, it's easy to... I was thinking about this the other day, how much I still feel like I felt 20 years ago. And I still feel the same. I still feel like I could do everything I could do in my 20s. Now I'm in my 40s, and the reality is it's different. You know, it's aging. The aging process is going on. But in another 20, 40 years of my life, where will I be? You know, where will I be? What will my meditation be? So this is something for us to consider and to take advantage of the appearance of such a personality like Narada Muni, who is giving us this knowledge and this information, taking proper advantage of the association that we have with the Vaishnavas, the Gurus, the Prabhupada, so that we can actually have a real aim in life. That we're not just fearful and unknowing. We have this wonderful opportunity. I think I'll leave it there. Would anyone like to ask a question or make a comment, share their realizations?
So, sublime, being surrounded by other devotees and living the body. So that, like, Srila Prabhupada has given us everything. How to become Krishna conscious and how to leave this body. If only we can invite this devotional practice of sadhana and be loving to devotees, so that devotees are there for us when we are. And it's so nice with Krishna Maharaj. Lokanath Swami was there. He was surrounded by all these wonderful devotees. So how nicely Krishna makes that arrangements. If only we pray to Krishna, please give us this opportunity to leave our body with any company with the surrounded by devotees.
Yes, it's true. Yes, it's often heard it described that death of the body is a change of service. Yeah. Yes. And you're very, very, very right. It's very important for us to cultivate real loving relationships with devotees at the time of death. We want to be surrounded by loving people going to assist us in that transition. Yeah.
Hare Krishna Mataji, thank you very much for the wonderful class. So I just have a couple of questions. My first question is, Ajamil, he chanted offenselessly. all his sins were completely eradicated. So then why did the Vishnu Dutas not take him back home, back to Godhead?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, why didn't he just whoop and go in? From what I heard in this time, is that he still needed to go through this process of devotional service. He had become purified, but he needed to become fully attached to Krishna. So that's why he went and he performed devotional service and really developed his relationship with Krishna and his attachment to and love for Krishna. So that, yeah, that's yeah. Yeah.
At the beginning of the class, you mentioned that the desires are seated in the heart. But then we also see that there's a lot of focus on controlling the mind. So are the desires actually located in the heart, or are they located in the mind? Because it's the mind that gets the pleasure from the materialistic desires, right? So, I mean, it probably doesn't matter whether it's located in the heart or the mind, but I was just thinking, are they located in the heart or the mind?
In this section, when I was reading the reports here, and also we read in the Nectar of Devotion, yes, how desires are seated in the heart, and they are in different stages. Yes, that some we're experiencing now, some are in a seed, some have fructified yet. So it's stated again that desires are seated within the heart. Definitely we experience the pains and pleasure of this body in different ways, but in terms of desire, I think yes, heart, seated in the heart, wonderful. Krishna Chandra Prabhu, anything extra? Yeah.
That's interesting, the discussion. Prabhu was saying that Namabhas doesn't lead to Krishna Prem. Namabhas doesn't lead to Krishna Prem, right? So it's interesting that it means that when we are sinless, it doesn't mean that we have entry into the kingdom of God. So we could be pure devotees, but if we're not engaged in the service, well, not pure devotees, but we could be sinless devotees, completely free of all sins. But if we are not engaged in the service of the Lord, that means we won't get entry into the kingdom of the Lord.
Yes, there's a difference between piety, leading a pious and pure life, and being Krishna's devotee, being Krishna's pure devotee. There's a difference there. So developing that real love, attachment for Krishna, just purely focused on Krishna's pleasure. How can I serve you with no other desire? That is something different than just being very pious and avoiding simple life. There's a difference. Definitely. Okay. Antar Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Nantapur Vaishnava ki jai.